The woman gripped her phone tightly, her voice firm as she spoke to the police. "I'm telling you, there's a black kid causing trouble in my yard." Soon, flashing lights filled the quiet street, and the sharp wail of sirens sliced through the calm afternoon air. In the middle of it all stood Jordan Mitchell, a 12-year-old boy, standing next to a police car. His face was pale, his hands trembling. A small crowd had gathered around, their whispers creating a murmur that filled the tense silence. This was how it all began. Jordan was a bright, polite kid who had just moved into the neighborhood with his mother. He loved basketball and could often be found outside, dribbling and practicing his shots. That's exactly what he was doing when it happened. The basketball slipped from his hands, bounced out of his driveway, and rolled across the street. Jordan chased after it, his laughter echoing as the ball came to a stop in a neighbor's yard. It wasn't a big deal, or at least that's what he thought. He walked to the edge of the yard and called out, "Hello? Excuse me? My ball's here." But no one answered. Jordan hesitated. He didn't want to cause any trouble, so he looked around, checking to see if anyone was watching. When no one appeared, he took a cautious step into the yard to grab his ball. What Jordan didn't know was that someone was watching. Margaret Whitman stood at her window, eyes narrowed as she watched him. To her, it wasn't just a boy retrieving his ball. It was something else entirely. Margaret's frown deepened, her mind racing with assumptions. Who is this kid? Why is he in my yard? Without waiting to find out, she grabbed her phone and dialed. "Hello, police? There's a black kid causing trouble in my yard," she said, her voice sharp and certain. "He looks suspicious. Can you send someone right away?" By the time Jordan picked up his ball and turned to leave, the sound of sirens made him stop. His stomach twisted as a patrol car pulled up, two officers stepping out with serious expressions. For a moment, he didn't understand what was happening. Why were they here? The officers walked up to him, their voices calm but firm. "What are you doing here, son?" one of them asked. Jordan tightened his grip on his basketball. I just can't get my ball," he said softly. Before he could say more, Margaret stepped outside, pointing directly at him. Her voice was louder now. "That's him. He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says. That boy doesn't belong in this neighborhood." The officers exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. One turned back to Jordan. "Son," he said calmly, "is that true? Were you trespassing?" Jordan looked down at his basketball, his voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't trespassing. I was just getting my ball." It rolled into her yard. Margaret folded her arms tightly, her voice sharp. "Oh, sure," she snapped. "That's what they always say. It starts with a ball, and before you know it, they're scoping out houses, looking for something to steal." The weight of her words hit Jordan hard. His eyes darted nervously between the officers, the crowd, and Margaret. His chest tightened. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, waiting for him to say the wrong thing. "Why didn't you stay in your own yard?" one officer asked. Jordan blinked, confused by the question. Was this really happening? Margaret smirked, folding her arms. "I told you," she said to the officers. "I knew he was up to something. But Jordan wasn't up to anything. He was just a boy with a basketball. And now, he was being treated like a criminal." The officers, uncertain but pressured by Margaret's insistence, made a decision. "You'll need to come with us for questioning," one said. Jordan didn't resist. He didn't argue, but his voice shook as he asked, "Can I call my mom?" What Margaret and the officers didn't know was that Jordan's mother wasn't just any parent. She was Governor Naomi Mitchell, the most powerful woman in the state. The phone rang in her office, and when she picked up, Jordan's trembling voice told her everything she needed to know. She didn't hesitate. She made one call, then another, and within minutes, her convoy was speeding toward the neighborhood. The sirens began, not one, not two, but an entire fleet of black SUVs barreling down the street, lights flashing, engines roaring. Margaret turned to look, her face twisting in confusion. What's going on? She had no idea what was coming. As the convoy rolled to a stop, the doors swung open, and out stepped Governor Naomi Mitchell. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Her presence alone demanded attention. Everyone knew who she was. But Margaret had thought this was just a simple case of trespassing. How could she have known that the boy she accused was the son of the state's most powerful woman? Naomi's gaze swept over the scene, the officers, the neighbors, Margaret, and finally landed on Jordan. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the thick tension. "What's happening here?" The officers hesitated. One of them cleared his throat nervously. "Governor Mitchell," he said respectfully, "we received a report of suspicious activity. This young man was seen on private property." Naomi raised an eyebrow and turned to Margaret. "And you made this report?" Margaret, struggling to regain composure, nodded quickly. "Yes, I saw him in my yard. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, so I called the police. I thought it was the right thing to do." Naomi let the silence hang. Then she turned back to the officers. "This is Jordan Mitchell, my son. And what evidence do you have to suggest he was doing anything suspicious?" The officers exchanged another uneasy glance. Naomi's voice remained even as she turned back to Margaret. "So," she said slowly, "a 12-year-old retrieves a basketball, and your first instinct is to call the police?" Margaret stiffened. "I didn't know who he was. He could have been anyone. And kids like him, they don't just wander into yards without a reason." Naomi's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped lower, sharper. "Kids like him," she repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" The tension in the air thickened. Naomi stepped closer, her voice calm but commanding. "Let me be very clear. You called the police on a child. You accused him without evidence. And now you stand here trying to justify it with assumptions that say far more about you than they do about him." Margaret swallowed hard. The realization of her actions hung heavy in the air. Naomi turned back to the officers. "I want this resolved," she said firmly. "And I want it done the right way. Because this wasn't just about Jordan. It was about every child who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And Naomi Mitchell wasn't just a governor. She was a mother. And she was ready to fight. Because next time, it wouldn't end here."